Picture this: a janitor, mop in hand, cleaning champagne spills while billionaires in $1,000 suits laugh at his expense. Just another invisible worker at another glamorous Manhattan party, right? Wrong. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that the man they were mocking had once been wealthier than most of them combined. And in exactly 2 months, he would become the reason their entire world came crashing down. Have you ever judged someone based on what they were wearing or the job they were doing? If you want to see how this story unfolds, drop a like right now, because what happens next will change the way you see everyone around you. The Harvest Charity Gala was a kind of event where fortunes were discussed as casually as the weather. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across marble floors. Women draped in designer gowns glided past men negotiating million-dollar deals over lobster and Dom Perignon. This wasn't just wealth on display. It was power, influence, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about tomorrow. At the center of it all stood Raymond Huxley, a billionaire real estate developer whose name appeared on skyscrapers across 3 states. That night, he wore an immaculate ivory suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. His entourage followed him like satellites orbiting a sun, laughing at his jokes, nodding at his observations, competing for his attention. Raymond moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who had never been told no. He shook hands with politicians, clinked glasses with hedge fund managers, and surveyed the room like a king inspecting his kingdom. Then, near the bar, something caught his eye. An older man in a gray custodial uniform was kneeling beside a spill, carefully polishing the marble floor. His movements were methodical, almost meditative. He worked with the quiet focus of someone who took pride in doing things right, even when no one was watching. Raymond saw an opportunity. He raised a champagne glass and projected his voice across the nearby crowd. "Hey, Chief, you missed a spot there." The room fell into that particular kind of silence that precedes laughter. Then it came, polite chuckles from the guests, a few knowing smirks exchanged between couples. The man with the mop looked up. His face showed no anger, no embarrassment, just a calm acknowledgement. He gave a small nod, gathered his supplies, and walked away with his shoulders back and his head held high. His name was Paul Rivera, and while Raymond Huxley returned to his champagne and his admirers, Paul carried with him something far more valuable than the laughter of strangers. He carried evidence. Evidence that would soon turn that laughter into silence. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who thought they were better than you? Someone who judged your worth by your job title or your bank account? Drop a comment below. We read every single one, and your stories matter. But let me take you back 7 years, before the janitor's uniform, before the humiliation, before Raymond Huxley ever had the chance to mock Paul Rivera. 7 years ago, Paul owned one of the largest construction companies in the state. Rivera Construction had built hospitals, schools, apartment complexes, and municipal buildings. His company employed over 200 people. Mayors knew his name. Contractors respected his integrity. He had a reputation for delivering quality work on time and under budget, which in construction industry was as rare as diamonds. Paul wasn't just successful, he was content. He had a wife, 2 kids in college, a home he'd built with his own hands. He attended community events. He mentored young entrepreneurs. He believed that if you work hard and played fair, the system would reward you. Then Raymond Huxley's firm entered the picture. It started with a bidding war for a major public infrastructure project, a contract worth $30 million to renovate the city's aging bridge system. Paul's company submitted a competitive, honest bid. But Huxley's firm had something Paul didn't: connections, insider access, and a complete disregard for the rules. Through a web of fraudulent contracts, falsified documents, and backroom deals with corrupt officials, Huxley's company not only won the bid, they systematically destroyed the competition. Paul's company was accused of code violations that never happened. Permits were mysteriously delayed. Subcontractors were pressured to break their agreements. Banks suddenly became reluctant to extend credit. Within 18 months, Rivera Construction went from thriving to bankrupt. Paul lost everything. The business he'd spent 20 years building vanished. His savings evaporated in legal fees, fighting accusations he couldn't disprove. The stress destroyed his marriage. His kids had to drop out of college. Friends stopped returning his calls. The community that once celebrated him now whisper about his fall from grace. At 56 years old, Paul Revere found himself starting over with nothing. Most people would have broken. Most people would have disappeared into bitterness or despair. But Paul was built differently. Somewhere in the wreckage of his life, he made a choice. He wouldn't just survive. He would seek the truth, not revenge. Truth. He took a job as a custodial worker through an agency that placed him in corporate buildings, hotels, and event spaces across Manhattan. The pay was minimal. The work was invisible. But it gave him something invaluable: access. One night, while cleaning an office building at 2 a.m, Paul struck up a conversation with a woman working late. Her name was Maria Chun, an investigative journalist who'd been quietly looking into corruption in the construction industry. When Paul told her his story, something clicked. Maria had heard similar accounts from other business owners, all destroyed by the same firm, all connected to Raymond Huxley. They formed an unlikely partnership. Paul would work, watch, listen, and document. Maria would connect the dots, find other victims, and build a narrative. Together, they would construct a case so airtight that not even Huxley's lawyers could dismantle it. If you're rooting for Paul right now, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. For the next 5 years, Paul Revere lived a double life. By day, or rather by night, he was an invisible custodian. He mopped floors in office buildings where Huxley's executives worked. He emptied trash cans that contained shredded documents. He cleaned conference rooms where deals were discussed after everyone thought the staff had gone home. And he remembered everything. Paul carried a small notebook tucked into his uniform pocket. After each shift, sitting in his modest studio apartment, he would transcribe what he'd seen and heard. Dates, names, phrases that seemed innocuous but fit into a larger pattern. He photographed discarded papers with his phone before disposing of them properly. He recorded conversations that happened in hallways when people thought no one was listening. Maria, meanwhile, was doing the harder work, the work that required credentials and connections Paul no longer had. She filed Freedom of Information requests. She interviewed former employees who left Huxley's firm under suspicious circumstances. She tracked money through labyrinthine corporate structures designed to obscure rather than illuminate. She built relationships with federal investigators who were already suspicious of Huxley but lacked concrete evidence. The investigation wasn't glamorous. It was tedious, meticulous, and often discouraging. There were months when nothing new emerged, moments when Paul questioned whether any of it mattered. He would stand in ballrooms like the one where he'd later be mocked, watching wealthy people celebrate their success, and wonder if justice was just a fairy tale we tell ourselves to cope with an unfair world. But then another piece would fall into place. Another victim would come forward. Another document would surface, showing a pattern of deception, so brazen it seemed almost cartoonish. Falsified safety inspections, bribed city officials, contractors paid to submit inflated bids to make Huxley's fraudulent bids look reasonable, public funds diverted into private accounts, infrastructure projects completed with substandard materials while Huxley pocketed the difference. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Paul discovered that he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every small business owner crushed by a system rigged against them, every community that received a dangerously built bridge because someone chose profit over safety, every worker whose pension disappeared because executives played accounting games. The evidence grew, slowly, methodically, undeniably. And then came the night of the Harvest Charity Gala. Paul hadn't requested that assignment. It was just where the agency sent him. When he saw Raymond Huxley holding court in his ivory suit, something cold settled in his chest. Not anger, not even satisfaction, just certainty. Because by that point, Paul knew something Raymond didn't. The federal investigation was days away from going public. The walls were closing in. And while Raymond Huxley mocked a janitor for missing a spot on the floor, that janitor was the reason his entire empire was about to collapse. Raymond Huxley made his biggest mistake that night. He thought Paul had forgotten. He thought Paul was defeated. He thought the man cleaning his spills was nothing. He was wrong on all counts. 2 months after the gala, The front page of every major newspaper in the country carried the same headline: Billionaire developer faces federal fraud charges in multi-million-dollar scheme. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. By noon, it had gone viral. By evening, it was the lead story on every news channel. The details were damning, specific, and impossible to deny. Raymond Huxley's firm had orchestrated one of the largest construction fraud schemes in state history. Over a decade, they had stolen more than $80 million in public funds through falsified bids, bribed officials, and deliberately substandard construction. Bridges that should have lasted 50 years were already showing dangerous signs of wear after 5. Schools built with his company's contracts had structural issues that put children at risk. Apartment buildings marketed as luxury developments were constructed with materials barely meeting minimum safety codes. But it wasn't just about the money or the shoddy work. It was about the systematic destruction of competitors. Federal investigators had documented at least 17 businesses that had been driven to bankruptcy through Huxley's coordinated campaigns of fraud, intimidation, and market manipulation. The press conference was held at the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. A podium stood before a backdrop of official seals and American flags. Federal prosecutors in dark suits prepared to address a sea of cameras and reporters. And standing beside them, in a simple gray suit, was Paul Rivera. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't invisible. The man who had been mocked for missing a spot on a marble floor was now the star witness in one of the biggest white-collar crime cases of the decade. His testimony, combined with the documentation he and Maria had gathered, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. When the lead prosecutor introduced Paul, explaining his role in exposing conspiracy, camera flashes exploded like lightning. Reporters shouted questions. The story had everything the media loved: a fallen hero seeking justice, a corrupt billionaire brought low, and a twist worthy of a Hollywood screenplay. Somewhere in his penthouse office, Raymond Huxley watched the press conference on television. He watched Paul Rivera speak calmly and clearly about the evidence they collected. He watched his own face appear on the screen in photo after photo documenting his crimes. He watched his stock portfolio implode in real time as investors fled his companies. He watched his carefully constructed empire begin to crumble. And perhaps, in that moment, Raymond remembered the janitor at the gala, the one he'd mocked, the one who had looked at him with quiet dignity and walked away. A reporter asked Paul how it felt to face the man who had ruined his life. Paul paused. The room fell silent. When he spoke, his voice was steady, without malice or triumph. Just simple, undeniable truth. Some people measure worth in dollars. Others measure in truth. The quote would be replayed thousands of times. It would trend on social media. It would be cited in op-eds and discussed on talk shows. But its power wasn't in its virality. It was in its accuracy. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that truth always wins in the end. It might not win quickly. It might not win easily. But it wins. So what does this story teach us? First, never judge someone's worth by their current circumstances. The janitor mopping your floor might be a former CEO. The barista making your coffee might be a published author working on their next book. The security guard checking your ID might be a veteran with more life experience than you'll accumulate in a decade. Everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Everyone you encounter has a story that would surprise you if you bother to ask. Second, dignity isn't determined by your circumstances. It's determined by your character. Paul Rivera lost his business, his saving, his marriage, and his reputation. But he never lost himself. He never became bitter. He never compromised his integrity for revenge. He sought truth, not retribution. And that distinction made all the difference. Third, the most dangerous opponent is the one you underestimate. Raymond Huxley looked at Paul and saw nothing, a forgettable worker, beneath his notice, too insignificant to matter. That blindness was his downfall. He never considered that the invisible people in his world might be paying attention. He never imagined that someone he'd crushed might have the patience and determination to rise again. Fourth, justice may move slowly, but when it's built on truth, it's inevitable. Paul didn't strike back immediately. He spent 5 years gathering evidence, 5 years working in silence, 5 years being dismissed and overlooked. But when the moment came, the case was unshakable. Truth is patient. Truth is thorough. Truth waits for the right moment, and then it doesn't just knock on the door, it kicks it down. After the trial, Paul didn't attempt to rebuild his construction empire. He didn't seek the spotlight or write a book or go on a speaking tour. He found work as a consultant for small businesses, helping them navigate complex contracts and avoid the pitfalls that had destroyed him. He remarried, a woman he met at a community meeting who loved him for who he was, not what he had. He reconnected with his children. He found peace. Raymond Huxley's fate was less poetic. Legal battles consumed his remaining fortune. His assets were seized to pay restitution to victims and fines to the government. His name became synonymous with corporate greed and corruption. The buildings that bore his name were quietly rebranded. The legacy he'd spent decades building evaporated in months. But the real lesson isn't about Raymond's fall. It's about Paul's choice. When life stripped everything away from him, he could have chosen bitterness, violence, or surrender. Instead, he chose patient determination. He chose to protect others from suffering the same fate. He chose truth over revenge. In that glittering ballroom full of people in expensive suits, the janitor was the only one with real power. Because power isn't what you have. It's what you do when you've lost everything and still find reason to stand back up. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now. Tell us in the comments, what would you do in Paul's position? Would you have the patience to seek justice over revenge? And subscribe to Earthly Tales for more stories that remind us what really matters. Not the size of your bank account, but the strength of your character. Remember, the people you overlook today might be the ones who change your world tomorrow. Treat everyone with respect. You never know who you're really talking to.